Hi students, this is week 2, lesson 3, and we're going to talk about the Industrial Revolution. It's something that you have heard about lots in your educational career, but we're going to talk about its connection to the origins of sociology. Really, the Industrial Revolution and observations, historic observations that sociologists made in hindsight when they were looking at the historic record that was left behind about life before the Industrial Revolution and social structure before the Industrial Revolution, and then life and social structure after the Industrial Revolution, there were some huge changes that could be observed in historic record, and there shouldn't be surprise about huge change, because that's why the word revolution is used when we're talking about industrialization to begin with. So industrial revolution, the word revolution meant massive social change. And even though typically historians say that it happened over a period of on average 80 to 100 years, that is a very quick period in history for social change, such abrupt and drastic social change to happen. And so there were some very, very interesting observable changes to micro-scale behavior and life outcomes that changed from one set of social facts to the next. So remember, we're not only talking about this for the origin of sociology reference, but we are working on developing our sociological imagination, that connection between macro-scale social structure and micro-scale life experience. Social facts is the patterned way of thinking, feeling, and acting that exists on the macro scale and exerts a lot of control over our life experiences and choices, successes and failures in our micro-scale daily lives. So keep those definitions and those explanations from previous lessons handy, because I want you to be synthesizing that information and working on developing that sociological imagination of yours. Okay, so the Industrial Revolution. Of course, you remember from history that this is when factories were built and machines were invented that could take the place of human labor. So let's talk about what social life was like on average. Remember, sociology is about trends on average across society and how social structure affects social behavior on a micro scale. So let's look at the social facts of life before the Industrial Revolution took place. Most people before the Industrial Revolution took place lived a rural lifestyle. They did not live in large cities. They lived in rural, small, close-knit communities, towns and villages, if you will. And that close-knit community had generations of the same families living there. So there was history that could go back for centuries where people's relatives knew each other throughout history, and there was that connection among the neighbors in that town that made it a very close-knit community. Not only were they a close-knit community emotionally and from a social support standpoint, but agriculture by hand, elbow grease style agriculture, was the kind of job that most people did in this society. Now, I am not telling you that there were no doctors and there were no bankers and there were no school teachers. Of course there were, but those jobs only existed because farms needed lots of workers. Whether you owned the farm and had a big family so that your kids could help you work the farm, or whether you owned a farm and had the big family and had several other families within the community that worked for you, there were lots of kids and lots of people focused directly with farming. And so all the other jobs were secondary to the fact that agriculture kept us all alive and produced that food that we needed to survive. Okay. So they were close-knit in that way too, economic closeness. Generational history, and there were really attentive social networks within these small, close-knit places. And that is kind of a polite way to say that everybody was in everybody's business. I know I had one of my students in previous classes give me that phrase when I was talking about how attentive neighbors were to each other. She said, "You mean everybody's in everybody's business?" Yep, that's what I mean. And that's actually a wonderful thing for social stability, because this next item on the list talks about how there was limited or even absent social problems like poverty or crime and suicide and other kinds of things like that. So poverty, for instance, if we're a close-knit community with generations of history among our family members in the past and very attentive and knowledgeable about each other's situations, baby, I'm not going to let you starve to death and you're not going to let me starve to death. And I'm going to come together and figure out a way that you can keep your house and the banker's not going to take it. And the banker is going to overlook those past payments due because his grandmama taught your grandmama in kindergarten, right? Or I guess they would be maybe not the same age. But anyway, you see what I'm saying. There's that connection and those very, very close, very few degrees of separation among everybody in the village, in the town. So in historic records, you saw very little social problems that compared to what you do today and compared to what you did after the Industrial Revolution changed the social facts that so many people lived under. You didn't see crime, you didn't see depression. We think of those kinds of things as like a mental condition, and in psychology class they might talk to you about the chemistry that can change that brings about this kind of depression or not. But let me just say, and some of you, especially if you are immigrants from Central American countries where depression is kind of not a thing, it's not even defined according to your heritage and your cultural background, depression and those kinds of mental illnesses are socially created, and they're part of a social expectation or not, lack thereof of social expectation rather than a psychological condition in so many cases. So, there's a lot of evidence of that worldwide, but that's not the topic here. So this is social facts before the Industrial Revolution. Pretty much everybody had a similar experience to what we're explaining here. But the Industrial Revolution took place, and the very first factories that were built, because if you remember from history class, that's what was the main thing, machines were invented to do the work that otherwise people were doing in the past. So what was the main focus of the innovations and the machines that were being built at first in the Industrial Revolution? Machines that could assist in agriculture and farming activities. Plows and transportation techniques that could make harvesting, planting, preparing, reaping, whatever the farm words are, all of those things were made easier and quicker with fewer hands on. Human hands were not necessary so much anymore after these machines were invented. And so I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Let's talk about how the social facts changed for the living conditions after the Industrial Revolution was in full swing. So, urban city life was created by the Industrial Revolution, okay? So, urbanization means city building. And so we're not just talking about building factories, but we're talking about building residences and social resources for people to live in those residences, like sewer systems. Although they didn't have it, honey, there was a lot of stinky stuff going on in the streets because you didn't have the kind of, gentle pastures and the people being attentive about what they were doing with their waste. You didn't have that kind of close-knit concern for each other. You had urban city life that had big skyscraper kind of apartment complexes that went in without really concern for comfort or for community. So these huge populations that lived in the city were populations of strangers, and strangers are always suspicious. We don't just have this concept of stranger danger in the modern world. This is something that you were taught to be leery of, because I don't know your background, you don't know mine, so you don't necessarily want to be open and trusting with me. And so there's a huge population, but you might be lonelier than you've ever been in your life because everybody is a stranger that you're afraid to trust because of your training about what strangers are. Everybody's a newcomer to these urban places, and so there's no generational history to fall back on. I don't know you, I don't know your people, and vice versa. So privacy becomes something that we really value because we're guarding ourselves. That suspiciousness of the other means that we need to guard ourselves. And social problems, therefore, according to the historic record, explode. And this is one of the observable facts that Emil Durkheim focused on when he was trying to explain what his concept of social facts is. Remember, social facts means, or it refers to the structure of society that a person lives in. And so Emil Durkheim looked at the massive change in the description of society from before the Industrial Revolution, excuse me, and the massive change in the description of society after the Industrial Revolution. And he noticed an explosion in things like poverty, in things like crime, and specifically in things like suicide, which a lot of times, again, I'm going to talk about psychology class in just a second, which psychology is a great field. I'm not dissing psychology at all. However, in psychology class, you might learn that suicide and suicidal tendencies are internal to the human being who is affected. But in sociology class, specifically using the work that Emil Durkheim first presented as an argument, he synthesized concepts and analyzed situations, and he presented an argument that social structure could bring about these suicide behaviors as a solution to some sort of social condition that was bringing someone down. So he looked at crime, which was virtually non-existent here, and it exploded here. He looked at poverty, which happened here, but not to a degree that you were going to starve to death because we all looked out for each other. Poverty happened here, and you starved to death because you were alone on the street. And those kinds of things exploded in this new social structure. So he came to the conclusion and successfully argued so that other people began to agree with him that social structure and its design not only exists on the macro scale and just stays there, but it trickles down with its patterned way of thinking, feeling, and acting that controls our life outcomes on a micro scale. It controls our decisions to a great extent. It controls whether we're going to have a success or a failure when we set a goal for ourselves. It has a whole bunch of nuances like that, that individually we live on a micro scale, but we're not necessarily responsible for our life outcomes 100% inside ourselves. Rather, the sociological imagination, social facts, and these kinds of concepts that point us toward macro scale trends and patterns, it gives us the ability to see the connection between macro scale social issues and micro scale life experiences. So, I hope that this has been enlightening about the Industrial Revolution. Perhaps this is not anything that your history teachers have, not a way that your history teachers have approached it with you in the past, perhaps. So please use one of the first two videos, this one, or one of the two videos that comes after this, to write your reaction paper on, or a combination of all of them. Make sure to take good notes because your quiz questions come from here. And thank you for watching. I will see you again very soon. Bye.